I always worked at night. It's not the shift most people prefer, but after a few years in security, you get used to it. My name is Oliver. I'm 48 years old, and I spend most of my nights as a watchman in an office building in a nearly dead part of town. During the day, the building is busy, full of lawyers, brokers, people of all kinds, but at night it becomes a kind of empty and silent museum. It's not the dream job, but it pays the bills. And to be honest, I even like the peace that the dawns bring, the constant silence, the routine without surprises, or at least it was like that until that night. On that specific morning, everything was the same. I had made my initial rounds on the ground floor, checked the entrance doors, and then locked myself in the security room as usual. With the cameras in front of me, I only needed to monitor any suspicions on the floors. The building is big. It has about 12 floors, but at dawn there is never anyone but me. But that night something started to bother me. It was subtle, but right away I felt like I was something out of the ordinary. The lights in the security room flickered from time to time, something I had never noticed before. It seemed like just an electrical problem, but in the absolute silence, each blink seemed more intense, as if it was trying to get my attention. I continued to sit there, trying to ignore the strange feeling and concentrating on the cameras. The monitors showed the empty corridors, the silent reception. Everything stopped as always. But at one point, a different glow caught my eye. I looked at the screen that showed the 11th floor and noticed that the lights were flickering. At the same time, I was tense. That part of the building must have been completely empty, since there was no commercial office there. Still, the lamps flickered, turning on and off almost in a rhythm, as if someone were flipping the switch. I decided to investigate. I took the flashlight and the radio. The elevator always gave me goosebumps at night, with that deep silence broken only by the sound of the cables. By the time I reached the 11th floor, the hallway was plunged into a silence now even stranger than usual. The lights were on. I moved forward a little, looked around, and noticed something that made me stop. On a table near the door was a mug, and what made me most uncomfortable was the fact that the mug was filled with still steaming coffee. My heart raced right away. I was sure that there was no one there when I arrived on shift, and no one was allowed to be on that floor at night. I stood there for a moment, staring at the mug, trying to process. Some employee might have forgotten, but the coffee was still too hot to have been left there for the day. I looked around, expecting to see some movement or hear a sound that explained it, but everything was quiet without a noise. I took a few more steps down the hallway, checking the doors of the rooms, but they were all locked, as they should have been. When I returned to the security room, I was restless. The lights kept flashing here and there on the cameras, always on the 11th floor. I sat in my chair, trying to ignore the feeling that something was wrong, but it only took a few minutes to notice something else out of place. One of the papers on the table in the security room was folded, as if someone had just touched it. It was a small detail, but it was enough to give me goosebumps. I had left everything organized before leaving, and no one else had the key to that room. By this time, my head was racing. I went to check the camera recordings to see if there was anything recorded or any movement, but curiously, I found nothing unusual. The images showed the same absolute silence as always. Still, I keep watching the monitors, with one eye on the 11th floor and the other on the door to the security room, feeling a constant shiver creeping up my spine. The idea that someone might have messed things up while I was investigating was starting to stick in my mind, and I couldn't think of a logical explanation for it. The silence was so intense that it seemed to press my ears, and each flicker of the lights on the monitor seemed more intense, almost mocking my presence there. I decided to leave the room once again, even with the feeling that I was being lured into an invisible trap. As I climbed the stairs, a thought crossed my mind. What if it wasn't just some intruder? The building had an old history, and some colleagues have commented on strange events, but I always ignored them, laughing at these stories. Now, with every step I took, that description seemed to evaporate, and I wondered if I was really alone there. When I returned to the 11th floor, the scene seemed to have changed. The coffee mug was still in the same place, but now there was a sheet of paper lying on the floor, folded, as if it had been placed there on purpose. I approached slowly, flashlight in hand, illuminating the paper. It was a blank sheet, but the way it was positioned on the floor made me feel like it was a silent message, a provocation. I looked around, more and more suspicious, but the walk remained quiet, immersed in an almost normal silence. I took a few steps down the hallway, trying to stay calm. As I progressed, I began to feel a strange sensation. It wasn't just darkness or silence. It was as if something invisible was there, watching me closely. I reached the last door in the hallway and touched the doorknob, which was unusually cold despite the air conditioning system being turned off. My hand trembled, and I hesitated before turning the handle. When I finally opened the door, the room was empty, but the smell of fresh coffee still hung in the air. I returned to the security room with my heart racing and a sense of growing discomfort. As soon as I sat down, I looked at the monitors again, and this time I noticed something new. In one of the cameras on the 11th floor, a shadow seemed to move in the background, almost imperceptible. I blinked a few times, thinking it was my mind playing tricks, but the shadow was still there, motionless. The face was not visible, but the outline was human. I felt an intense cold run down my spine, as if someone was hanging around me and watching my every move. I got up from my chair and instinctively walked through the door of the security room. My only thought was that if it was really someone, that person would be bullying me, playing games with me. But at the same time, rationality tried to telling me that this was impossible, that no one could have access to the upper floors without the keys. I stood there trying to fool myself when suddenly the lights in the security room flashed one last time and went out completely, plunging me into absolute darkness. The darkness took me by surprise, and for a second I was paralyzed, trying to get used to the pitch black. The silence was so general that I could hear my own breathing, faster and heavier. I took the flashlight in my pocket and turned it on, illuminating the monitors, but now all the cameras were down. I took a deep breath, fighting the panic that was trying to infect me. I decided that I needed to do something, call the police, leave it to solve this in the morning. But as I took the first step out of the room, I heard something, a muffled sound coming from the hallway, like slow, heavy footsteps getting closer and closer. I swallowed hard and pointed a flashlight at the door. I knew I had locked it up, but the idea that someone or something was on the outside made my heart beat even faster. The footsteps stopped right at the front of the room, and for a moment, everything was silent again. I stood there motionless, barely breathing, until I heard what sounded like a slight tap on the handle, as if someone was testing the lock. The sound was enough to make me retreat, trying to keep the flashlight steady, but feeling the sweat running down my forehead. At that moment, I was sure that whatever it was there with me, and I had no intention of leaving me alone. The relevant seconds drag, each one more unbearable than the other, until the footsteps moved away again. I couldn't figure out what it could be. My instinct told me to run, but my legs seemed to be stuck to the ground. As soon as I gained courage, I unlocked the door and left the security room. I decided to go down the stairs and leave that building once and for all. Every step was guided by the flashlight, and the sound of my shoes echoed in a way that made me feel more and more vulnerable. But as I descended, I heard a louder sound coming from the floor above, a door closing violently. I stopped, trying to listen, but silence reigned again. The flashlight was shaking in my hand and everything in me was telling me to keep going down, but something made me look back. As I illuminated the top of the stairs, I saw a shadow standing there at the end of the hallway. It was just a silhouette, but something about it was deeply disturbing. He looked human, but his posture was rigid, almost inhuman. I couldn't see the face, but I had the feeling that I was smiling as if I knew the terror I was feeling. I didn't wait another second and continued down the stairs as fast as I could, almost tripping over the steps. My breathing was uncontrolled, and the weight of fear seemed to pull me down, making every movement difficult. When I finally got to the ground floor, I ran towards the main door. It was locked. I tested all the keys, pulled and pushed the door hard, but it seemed that something was preventing me from leaving. Despair took over, and I began knocking on the door, hoping that someone could hear. But the neighborhood was too isolated for there to be any hope of help at that time. I reached into my pockets looking for my phone, but remembered that I had put it to charge in the security room. I took a deep breath, trying to regain control. I looked around and realized that the only way was to go back to the security room and get my cell phone. I had no other choice. With slow and cautious steps, I began to cross the dark corridor towards the elevator, but as I passed the reflection of a glass, I felt a chill. I saw something moving behind me, an indistinct shadow that disappeared as soon as I turned around. Everything in me screamed, saying that I shouldn't go back, but I needed to try to call someone. Anything not to spend another minute alone in that building. I got to the security room again, and the first instinct was to pick up my phone and try to call, but as soon as I walked in, I noticed something that froze me. The lights were not on, but the computers were on and showing the cameras, all with static images, as if they had been accessed recently. Stranger still was the fact that the office was completely disorganized. The drawers were open, papers scattered across the table, and something even more disturbing. The camera on the 11th floor had an image of me, static on her screen. The feeling of being watched intensified. My whole body was on alert, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I picked up my phone, and when I looked at the screen, my finger hesitated. At that moment, something in the room made me realize that I was not alone. The light of the flashlight flashed slowly, as if trying to warn that something was about to happen. I tried to force my mind to believe that it was all the result of fear, but then I heard the sound of a breath, light and sharp, seem to be behind me. I froze. The sound of my breathing seemed so close that for a moment I thought it was the breath itself being amplified by fear. But it wasn't. I turned slowly, holding the flashlight in the direction of the sound, and it was then that I saw a figure, which was now transformed and no longer looked like the silhouette of a human, was standing at the entrance outside the room, with its head partially tilted, as if it was watching me closely. But the worst thing was the absence of details. There was no face, no expression, just a form that seemed molded and undefined, a shadow that moved fluidly, as if it were made of a substance that was not limited to space. I tried to scream, but my voice failed. I was paralyzed, my muscles stiff and cold. Terror came over me in such a way that, as I looked again at the door, I saw that it was open, the same door that I had so carefully locked. The figure was no longer there. I knew that if I stayed there any longer, my sanity would be lost. I thought about calling the police, but my cell phone strangely didn't turn on. The phone in the living room was squeaking. Now the silence gave way to noises of tables, chairs being thrown on the floor, walls being spidered, a high-pitched sound that caused despair, noise of sheets of paper being torn. The only thing I could do was lock the door again, drag the table, and put it in front of it. I stood there with no sense of time. Covering my ears until everything stopped, I sat in the chair, still incredulous of everything that was happening there. That's when suddenly my cell phone started ringing. I almost knocked him down. When I saw who was calling me, it was my colleague. I was desperate. I wanted to tell him everything, ask for help. But he was soon apologizing to me because he hadn't heard the phone ring, that he only saw it now in the morning, but wanted to know why I called him so many times during the night. I started talking, terrified, saying that I wasn't the one who called him. I tried to tell him what had happened. He started laughing and said he was almost there. I didn't know what else to think. I put the desk in place. The computers and cameras were working normally. I looked at the corridors and there was nothing out of place. The rooms were organized as if nothing had happened. That was my last night of work in that building. I never went back there. I also never forgot every second of terror I spent.